Hello, everybody. Welcome to a special episode of Asia Inside Out. I'm here today with ASPI's distinguished non-resident fellow, the Honorable Jeffrey Feltman, to discuss the ongoing and unfolding situation in the Middle East and the implications for regional and global politics and security. I have with me the Honorable Jeffrey Feltman, who is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer who concentrated in the Middle East and North Africa with tours in Israel and the Palestinian territories. Ambassador Feltman was also ambassador to Lebanon. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and continued to work on the evolving situation in the Middle East when he moved to the United Nations as the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs. So thank you so much for joining me, Jeffrey. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here and have this conversation with you about a terrible situation that will be unfolding for some time.
Yeah, so for anyone who has not been following the news, we're here today to discuss the developments over the last week. There was a major terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas in Israeli territories this last Saturday. And since then, there have been a continued Israeli response, including bombardment of Gaza, where Hamas is based. And, I really want to get into, Jeffrey, now that we've had several days to kind of see this situation unfold, what has surprised you most about the regional reactions to the Hamas terrorist attack and also regional reactions to Israel's response?
Roy, if I may, I think my biggest surprise in this awful situation wasn't necessarily the regional reaction, but it was the Israeli intelligence failures. Because to put this in context, you think about the 9/11 attacks against the United States. There were 19 hijackers. Who knows how many people were working with those hijackers to pull those up? But we're probably talking about, a few dozen people. A terrorist attack into Israel from Gaza included hundreds, if not thousands. There are estimates of up to 4,000 people infiltrated. And Israel believed that it had the Gaza Strip very well surveilled through technical means, through human sources, etc. But yet Hamas was able to pull off a terrorist attack that included thousands of people by air, by sea, by land, and included abductions, where they were able to rampage over 30 square miles, area of southern Israel for hours before the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, showed up. So my biggest surprise was that Israel had become complacent with its understanding of the Gaza Strip and had failed to anticipate this. It was a much bigger failure, in my view, than the U.S. failure in 9/11, simply because of the sophistication, the scale of the attack. I think another thing I found interesting about the regional reaction, to get to your question, was there was an Emergency Security Council session that was called on Sunday, a few days ago, the day after the news came out about some of the atrocities that Hamas terrorists had been committing against Israeli citizens. And the United States joined with the United Arab Emirates to draft a statement that the Security Council was to issue that condemned the terrorist attack, that condemned the attacks on civilians. It never got released because the Russians blocked it. The Russians didn't like the language about the need about targeting civilians. I think we can guess why the Russians would have blocked that. But it was interesting that the UAE felt confident enough to join with the United States in condemning what should be condemned. It's logical to condemn what Hamas did. The stories that are coming out about what happened to the victims, and of course the abductions, the human shields that have been taken back to Gaza is a war crime. So it's not illogical to condemn this. But given the fact that the UAE was one of the countries that signed the so-called Abraham Accords, that came to a formal understanding, diplomatic recognition with Israel, felt confident enough about its public opinion to be able to condemn all this through a Security Council presidential statement, I think is significant. because the UAE must have anticipated that the Israeli response to these terrorist attacks is going to cause a lot of civilian casualties in Gaza. Gaza, an urban built-up area, and urban warfare, as we saw in Fallujah with the U.S. troops, as the Israelis saw in Beirut in 1982, has a lot of caused a lot of civilian casualties, which is going to rile up the Arab public for understandable reasons. But yet the UAE proceeded with doing this, which I thought was interesting. I was also, this is farther away, but I'd be interested in your views on this. I was also surprised by India's reaction. This is farther from the region, but India and Israel only established diplomatic relations in 1992. I served many years in Israel, and I remember that there was sort of a correct but cold relationship between Israel and India. India is a champion of the global South. India, in my UN experience, my 6 years at the UN, was often siding with the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli resolutions, the General Assembly and elsewhere. So I was surprised to see how strongly Prime Minister Modi condemned what happened to the Israeli civilians, how strongly he stood with Israel against this terrorist attack. And for me, that was something, as I'm not a scholar of Indian politics, but it was something that I'm sort of interested in what you may have to say about that, because it was different than the Indian-Israeli relationship I was familiar with from my time at the UN and from my time serving in Israel.
Yeah, I think there have been really different interpretations of the strength of the Indian response to this attack, and particularly India's and Prime Minister Modi's unwavering support for Israel. On the one hand, there are personal relationships. I think that Prime Minister Modi in particular is a leader who really values relationships built, and has clearly built a close relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, and feels very strongly that the value of that relationship should come out in India's foreign policy and its relationship with the state-to-state relationship between India and Israel. I think India is, as you rightly pointed out, is incredibly concerned about terrorist attacks and about the need for a strong, mobilized state response when incidents of terror occur. So I think those considerations right now are outweighing other considerations that India might have about its relationship, its brand, if you will, or its status in the Arab world that is, as you rightly pointed out, will be reacting very strongly to Israeli actions in Gaza. I wonder if I can ask you whether or not some of the outcomes that we're seeing and the diplomatic reaction is indicative of larger strategic shifts in the Middle East. One strategic shift is the one that you pointed out, the UAE coming out, and joining a UN resolution in support of Israel. I think there's also the recent development of Saudi-Iran normalization that's adding a layer of complexity to this picture. And of course, that was a development that was brokered or in some ways facilitated, mediated by China. Where do you see the kind of larger regional picture going? Some analysis has said that that there might be a sense in the region. Sorry, let me start that again. Where do you think these strategic shifts are leading us? Are Arab countries becoming more willing, able to tolerate a continued Israeli presence than they once were? And is that reflected in some of the diplomatic maneuvering and calls for de-escalation that you're seeing in the region right now?
Yeah. If you look at the countries that have one type of peace agreement, diplomatic recognition with Israel, of course, Egypt was the first, and Jordan, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan is a special case. But you can see, and then after the Oslo Accords in the early 90s, there were also diplomatic exchanges between Tunisia and Oman in Israel. Those dried up with the Second Palestinian Intifada that broke out in September 2000. But you can see that the bulk of the Arab world is dealing with the fact that Israel is a reality in their region, and more than that, countries like the UAE see Israel as a strategic partner in terms of economic growth, investment, in terms of security, intelligence sharing, in terms of being a counterweight to Iran. So yes, I think that in general, much of the Arab world, not all of it, you've got the Syrias of the world, but much of the Arab world is living with the fact that Israel is a reality in the region. But the issue that's of immediate importance, I think, is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains unresolved, and that all of these agreements that I have mentioned have essentially leapfrogged over the Palestinian issue to the distress of the Palestinians. And it's hard to put your head into the mind of Hamas terrorists that would kidnap grandmothers and shoot babies, of what they're really thinking. But I would suspect that one of their objectives was to put the Palestinian issue back in the news, and of course that has happened, not in a way that I think particularly benefits the Palestinian people, but I think Hamas was sending a signal that you can't ignore the Palestinian issue. You can't leapfrog over us and expect the region to be stable and in peace. So in that, unfortunately, Hamas has been successful. I mean, even in our country, Donald Trump is not the top of the news these days. It's the atrocity the Hamas terrorists committed, and now the very brutal war that Israel will be doing in terms of a response. There is, of course, the so-called axis of resistance: Iran, Syria, the Iranian proxies such as Hezbollah, to some extent the Houthis in Yemen, to some extent Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It's a counterweight to all of this. But when you look at the countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, they don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. They see that as a threat. That was the roots of Hamas, were Muslim Brotherhood. And whatever they're doing in order to live with Iran, they don't particularly like Iran either. They don't trust Iran either. And Hamas has both Muslim Brotherhood and Iran connections. So I think one of the reasons why you're not going to see a really strong reaction from the Gulf countries is because they don't like Hamas either. But they're going to have to balance their distaste for Hamas, along with their strategic interest in maintaining ties with Israel, with the public opinion that's going to be extremely distressed over what we're going to see in the coming days and weeks of the Israeli reprisal. And I think that my prediction is the UAE, Bahrain will just go very quiet. They'll just try not to draw attention to themselves. Saudi Arabia is a different case, because Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, had been very forward-leaning in recent interviews in the media about progress in moving towards some kind of relationship with Israel. They weren't there yet, but he was signaling that things were moving in an interesting direction, that this would be historic. I think he was preparing his public for the possibility of this, because the Saudi public, like many Arab countries, is very much pro-Palestinian, and I think he was preparing his people. What happens now? I would expect there's going to be outrage. The Israelis are going to do things that are going to outrage the Arab public. The atrocities that Hamas committed will be downplayed or seen as in the past. And then what does Mohammed bin Salman do? If he has this public that's really upset, but yet he's been out there saying before this that things were moving in the right direction, does he abandon the effort? If he abandons the effort, Hamas wins. Basically, Hamas says we've derailed the Israeli-Saudi thing, and it makes him look weak. He's changed his policy. If he continues, he's going to have to be extremely sensitive to that Saudi public opinion that I predict is going to become increasingly pro-Palestinian as the days go on. So we'll see. I would suspect that it will prompt him to think more about the Palestinian side of an Israeli-Saudi understanding. Mohammed bin Salman had been very clear with what he expected from the United States in terms of security guarantees, support for nuclear enrichment, support for weapons. He'd been more ambiguous about what he expected the Israelis to do for the Palestinians. He may become more specific now. Of course, it's a bad time. The Israelis are going to be in no mood for concessions, but it would help him square the circle of how he continues to move in the direction he indicated he wanted to move, while also being cognizant of the concerns of his population.
So I wonder if what is your perspective on whether or not Hamas can continue to speak for the Palestinian people after this? I mean, Hamas is not the only representative of the Palestinian people. There's the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. There are recent polls that I've looked at that say that the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel was supported by the majority of the Palestinian people living in Gaza. There's now this kind of additional pressure on Hamas as a unitary actor, perhaps. Reports coming out that Iran's intelligence was surprised by this attack. Is there an opportunity ahead to look at the Palestinian issue and the Hamas issue, the Hamas atrocities, as two separate issues? Or is Hamas so intrinsically linked to the Palestinian cause that this will only further deepen enmity between the Israelis and the Palestinian people, the civilians who are in Gaza, who are bearing the brunt of the punishment for Hamas's activities?
This may be ancient history, but I'm thinking the time that I was U.S. ambassador to Lebanon. I was there during the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. And Hezbollah provoked the war by kidnapping 2 Israeli soldiers in Israel with a very sophisticated operation and bringing them back into Lebanon. They died of their wounds. But Hezbollah provoked that war. The war was devastating. Nothing like what we're seeing now, but the war was devastating. And in the initial days, the Lebanese were so angry at Hezbollah for ruining their summer, for ruining the tourism that was propping up the economy. They were just furious with Hezbollah. But that changed the longer the war went on, the more that the Lebanese were suffering. And I worried that the same thing could happen in Gaza, that I would expect that most of the 2.2 million people were appalled by what happened. I hope they were appalled as human beings because of the way that the Israeli civilians suffered, but they were probably also appalled, or more appalled by they knew what was coming. They knew that the Israelis were going to be responding in force, and so I don't think Hamas would have had public support for what they have done. And the Israelis have vowed to smash Hamas, to eliminate Hamas, which is pretty hard. A terrorist organization like Hamas, all you have to do is have 1 or 2 people survive somewhere, and when the military operations are over, pop up and say, "I'm still here," and proclaim victory just because they survived, even if their capacity has been degraded. But you've touched on a bigger problem, Rorry, which is the lack of credible leadership that can rally the Palestinians around a unified approach to their position in the region, a unified approach to how they would deal with a serious attempt at negotiations. Hamas was not popular in Gaza because of the way that the sort of theocratic, autocratic rule that it had. It was more popular, weirdly, in the West Bank, where they weren't under Hamas rule. And the Palestinian Authority, based in Ramallah, product of the Oslo Accords from 1993 and onward, it's discredited as well. It's discredited in part because of corruption, but it's discredited in part as well because it was not able to advance the Palestinian aspirations for an independent state that in which they can live with dignity. And that, I think, all of us share some blame. Primarily the Israelis, that they looked at the Palestinian Authority as a policeman protecting their security, not as a representative government in the making that should be built up in order to be able to have credibility to pull the people together. So at the end of whenever these military operations end, and whenever the dust settles and what will be left of the Gaza Strip, the Israelis face a problem. There is no credible Palestinian leadership that would be able to step in there, at least none that I can identify. And the Israelis are not going to want to stay and try to administer a territory of 2.2 million people that will be more hostile toward Israel today than it was a week ago. So I think there's a real problem that the secular Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, have been discredited. They've discredited themselves, plus the lack of progress on the peace process has discredited them. And Hamas will be seriously degraded, if not eliminated, and they weren't particularly popular anyway.
I think we all are expecting the humanitarian situation in Gaza to get worse, just based on the preponderance of military power that Israel is bringing to bear to, in its words, crush Hamas. Its leadership has said that Gaza will never look the same and made other comments suggesting that the scale of what is to come in Gaza is really large. You spent a fair amount of your time in the United Nations and just working with the international community on these issues. What do you think the international community can do at this moment to address the actions of Hamas, these atrocities that Hamas has committed, while still managing or minimizing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
You're absolutely right. There is a humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian conditions were bad before Saturday, and now they're much worse, and they're going to get worse. But I think that we have to. I'm not going to. I do not excuse things like, a siege cutting off all food and medicine. That is not the right way to try to approach things. But I think we have to understand where the Israelis are coming from. Had we had the same scale of murder in 9/11 that they had on Saturday, we would have had 300,000 American citizens killed. 300,000 versus just under 3,000. The trauma that the Israelis have experienced is tremendous. And those of us that want to see humanitarian assistance flow to the civilians in Gaza need to keep in mind that when we talk to the Israelis. I think calling for opening a humanitarian corridor, for example, sounds like it makes sense from a humanitarian angle. Why in the world would the Israelis agree to that right now when they're still facing rockets? There's still been rockets fired even today. I think that what the humanitarian community needs to do is focus on very specific needs and go to the Israelis. It's labor intensive, but one by one, and say, Shifa Hospital needs this. And we're going to get this to Shifa Hospital in this way. And at the same time, keep up the drumbeat of trying to get assistance, knowledge, intelligence, information about the hostages, about the human shields. This is unprecedented to have 150. Well, I don't know. The numbers keep changing. Somewhere between 97 and 150 people who have been spirited away, kidnapped, abducted. This is a war crime. But this looms large in Israel, and on 97 people is not 2.2 million people, but there are still human beings who are being held, and we need to show that we understand that their families are concerned, that we're trying to figure out how to address that, just as we're trying to figure out how to get medicines and fuel to Shifa Hospital. I just don't think saying to the Israelis right now, it's wrong for you to besiege Gaza, which it is wrong, is going to get us anywhere. We're going to have to look at very, very specific things. I'm encouraged to hear the Egyptians. On the one hand, the Egyptians do not want to be the recipient of 2.2 million Gazans. They have made it clear that they are not going to be the solution for the Gaza Strip, but they have moved humanitarian supplies close to the border. I think anticipating either that the humanitarian supplies will eventually go in from Egypt, or that there will be some refugees that leave Gaza for the Sinai. But humanitarian actors, UN or otherwise, have to keep in mind the trauma that the Israelis are feeling after these atrocities, and talk to them in a way that they can understand. I really think that right now, finger wagging about the siege is counterproductive.
The U.S., has obviously come out in strong support for Israel, and I think in solidarity for understanding the feelings of the Israeli people after this terrible terrorist attack. The U.S. has also sent a carrier strike group, the Gerald Ford strike group, to the region in order to bolster deterrence. I'm wondering if you could just talk us through a little bit what the thinking behind putting a U.S. military asset in the region is at this point. On the one hand, there are all of these calls, I think, from the U.S., from the region, from the international community to work towards de-escalation. On the other hand, it seems as though, the U.S. is putting itself in a position to be a part of the conflict if need be. So tell us a little bit about how you think the U.S. policy is evolving on this.
And without question, the U.S. Has gone all in with supporting what Israel thinks it needs to do to respond to this. And those of us concerned about the fate of the Palestinians would like to see a little bit more emphasis on the need to comply with international humanitarian law and all of that. But the fact is that right now, the U.S. is all in understanding the need for Israel to respond to these atrocities. And of course, Israel, the U.S. has also sent experts to try to help the Israelis deal with the hostage situation, which apparently includes some American citizens as well as nationals from other countries. I think that the strike group is more aimed at Iran. More aimed at. I don't think it has anything to do with Gaza per se. It's a warning to Iran that if Hezbollah would start releasing its arsenal, that the U.S. has ways to respond to that. If you look at previous situations like this, again, I'm going back to 2006 war. We're all prisoners of our own experience. The U.S. had a similar view after the Hamas attack. After the Hamas kidnapping of the Israeli soldiers. This is, of course, small compared to what happened to the Israelis on Saturday. And then Hamas, when Israel started retaliating, Hezbollah started lobbing rockets into Israel, temporarily displacing hundreds of thousands of people. And the U.S. was very supportive of Israel's right to respond to this. But as the time goes on, you start to see more conditionality in the U.S. statements. You start to see, you need to be more careful. You need to take different measures. You need to address the fact that without electricity, there'll be sewage pumped into the Mediterranean that hits Israel too. You'll see the conditionality. I think the same thing will happen in Gaza, where the U.S. will, as the military operations proceed, you'll see, and the reports of suffering by the Palestinians come to light, you're going to see more and more concern expressed by the Americans. What I hope will happen is that the gap between now, with the full-throated support for Israel to do whatever it wants, and then the support for Israel, but with some messages about the need to protect civilians, I hope that gap is relatively brief. I should say something else on humanitarian assistance. I understand why the humanitarian actors from the UN and others are really emphasizing international humanitarian law and all of that. But we have to think about, is this the time to score the political points when Israel has suffered from such terrorism, that Israel too is violating things? Or is this the time we think practically, how do we get medicine into Shifa Hospital? And that's why for right now, I would lower the general references to international humanitarian law and raise the specific requests and how one would get them there without diversion to Hamas.
I think one thing that is coming out in the statements from Asian countries, not just the big statements, from China, but also from Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, do underscore what you've said about putting the issue of a Palestinian statehood front and center as this crisis unfolds. So many of those statements reference, the kind of the core issue that needs to be addressed, the root cause of the problem being this unresolved status of statehood for Palestine. Where do you think that the solutions for, Israel, Palestine, let's call it peaceful coexistence for lack of a better term, where do you think we stand on the path toward that goal after the events of the last week?
Roy, I think that countries like China, who have called for implementation of the two-state solution in recent statements, who've called for de-escalation, ceasefire, would have a lot more credibility if they also were condemning the type of really atrocious murders that took place on Saturday. When they call for de-escalation, ceasefire, without condemnation of what happened, the Israelis are going to hear this in a certain way. They're going to hear that the Chinese aren't actually neutral. They're actually siding with the Palestinians because they aren't condemning the terrorism. And this, of course, China is a country that has what they say zero tolerance for terrorism when it comes to Xinjiang. That they're a country that's supposed to be standing for zero tolerance for terrorism, and their statements have been quite weak. So I would imagine that the Israelis are not hearing the Chinese statements in the belief that they're being issued in good faith. In terms of the long-term solution, of course, this is now back on the agenda, whereas, as we said earlier, the Palestinian issue had been more or less sidelined by everyone else except the Palestinians. And now people are going to have to think about this again. As difficult as it is to imagine how it could be implemented, I still think that the two-state solution is the only way forward, because the Israelis don't want the Palestinians living with them. The Palestinians don't want the Israelis living with them or being under Israeli tutelage any longer. And the idea of expelling basically 4 or 5 million Palestinians, which some of the ministers in the government that was just replaced by the unity government have said is the goal, is not realistic. I don't think Jordan or Egypt or other countries are going to absorb the Palestinians, nor do I think they're going to leave. They learned that lesson in 1948 when they left their houses. So the only way this is going to be resolved is through a two-state solution. But that solution was already at risk of disappearing because of settlement expansion, because of settler violence in the West Bank, and getting the Israelis to think seriously again about a two-state solution when they've just been through this trauma and outside from Gaza is going to be hard. But I will give one little glimmer of hope. Israel in 1973 was shocked on the Yom Kippur War, another intelligence failure. Arab armies from Syria and Egypt jointly attacked Israel and Israeli occupied territories on Yom Kippur, took the Israelis by utter surprise, strategic failure. That led to the Camp David Accords. The shock of that created the atmosphere by which the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel were codified, which returned the Sinai to Egypt. And while it's not an easy relationship at a public level between the Israelis and the Egyptians, the peace has existed. The peace has continued, and so one hopes that at some point the shock of what happened to the Israelis and the shock of what's happening in Gaza now will create the atmosphere to revive some kind of process toward a two-state solution.
Thank you so much for sharing all these insights with us and for leaving us on a potentially positive note. Be sure to, follow our work in the weeks to come as we think more about how this conflict is reverberating throughout Asia. Once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.